Welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you're joining us today because we're exploring a tension that is honestly quite profound. We're asking a pretty massive question today. What happens when the private hidden life of one of history's absolute greatest scientific minds directly collides with the very theories he put out into the world?
Right, and it's a dynamic we rarely pause to consider when we read about historical figures. We have this tendency to separate the genius from the human being. We put the theory on a pedestal and completely forget that a messy, complicated person actually had to write it down.
Exactly. I mean, when you learn about a towering figure in a high school biology textbook, you get the neat, polite summary. You get the grand theory, maybe a line drawing of a finch, and that's about it. But for this deep dive, our mission is to move way beyond those polite summaries. We're going to look at the intensely human story behind Charles Darwin, and specifically, his profound personal contradictions.
Which are fascinating.
They really are. And I should mention, our conversation today is grounded entirely in a highly detailed paper by Jake Weaver. It's titled Charles Darwin, A Factual Reassessment. We're also pulling from some really interesting commentary on that paper by Richard Price.
And right off the bat, I think it is crucial to establish the lens we are looking through today, because our goal isn't to judge Darwin from our 21st century high horse. We aren't here to condemn him or tear down his scientific achievements.
No, definitely not.
Instead, we want to impartially examine the historical record provided in Weaver's research. We just want to look at the tension between Darwin's incredibly rigorous, evidence-driven mind and his deep, personal, very raw emotions.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Weaver's research starts with a pretty striking historical fact. It's one of those things you might have heard as a trivia question, but when you really look at it, it's wild. In 1839, Charles Darwin married a woman named Emma Wedgwood. Emma was his first cousin.
And the sources clarify that it goes even deeper than that. If we look at the specific family tree documented in Weaver's paper, this was actually a double first cousin marriage.
A double first cousin.
Yes. Darwin's father and Emma's mother were siblings, and Darwin's mother and Emma's father were also siblings.
Wow. Okay, so at that point, the family tree isn't really a tree anymore. It's more of a wreath.
That's one way to put it. The genetic ties were exceptionally close. Now, it is important to remember the Victorian context here. The Wedgwoods and the Darwins were prominent, wealthy families. In that era, marrying within the extended family was often a strategic move.
Right, to consolidate wealth and keep estates intact.
Exactly, maintain social standing, so it wasn't entirely taboo in high society.
Right, so you might be thinking, well, it was the 19th century. Maybe they just didn't know the biological risks associated with that kind of close intermarriage. They didn't have modern genetics. But Weaver's paper makes it explicitly clear that Darwin absolutely wasn't ignorant of those risks.
Not at all. In fact, in 1838, which is a full year before the marriage took place, Darwin was deeply immersed in a book called Zoonomia.
And who wrote Zoonomia?
His own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. And this wasn't just a casual read for him. The book explicitly listed what it called the hereditary taint resulting from inbreeding. Erasmus specifically cited outcomes like feebleness, idiocy, and epilepsy. He warned against it.
So the scientific concept of inbreeding risks wasn't just out there in the ether. It was actively circulating in his own family's intellectual history.
Precisely. Darwin was reading warnings written by his own bloodline.
That is wild. It's one thing to have a vague worry, but reading a medical warning from your own grandfather is hard to ignore. And we know Darwin internalized this, right?
Yes, the documentation proves he did. In 1838, the exact same year he was reading Zoonomia, Darwin wrote a letter to his sister Caroline. He confessed a deep, private fear regarding his genetic compatibility with Emma. He wrote, and I quote, "I hope you won't think me mad, but I'm afraid our blood is too close."
Wait, let me stop you there. If he read Zoonomia a full year before the wedding, and he literally wrote to his sister that he was terrified their blood was too close, why on earth didn't he just call off the marriage? Was the social or financial pressure just that high?
That is the crux of the entire reassessment. It establishes this incredible contradiction. Despite possessing this very clear, scientifically grounded fear, he proceeded with the marriage anyway.
Right.
Weaver notes there is no recorded medical consultation. There is no public disclaimer.
He just ignored it.
He simply pushed his scientific dread aside and moved forward with his personal desires and family expectations.
And the ultimate irony comes decades later, right?
Yeah.
Because he didn't just ignore the science in his personal life, he actively championed it in his professional life.
Exactly. In 1868, long after his marriage, Darwin published a massive work called The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. In that published public work, he explicitly warns that close interbreeding in livestock leads to, and again, these are his words, degeneracy, feebleness, sterility. He cited extensive data on cattle, sheep, and horses. He knew the data inside and out.
So he is broadcasting these severe biological warnings to the agricultural world, applying them rigorously to the animal kingdom, while living entirely within the reality of a double first-cousin marriage himself. The disconnect is just staggering.
It's a stark divide between his private actions and his public scientific assertions. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it doesn't just stay a theoretical contradiction.
No, it doesn't. And here's where it gets really interesting and honestly deeply tragic. So he has this internal dread before the wedding. But fast forward a few years, and that dread doesn't just stay in his head, does it? It starts playing out right in his living room.
Yes. Between 1839 and 1858, Darwin and Emma had 10 children. And Darwin, being perhaps the ultimate observer in scientific history, didn't just raise his kids. He kept a meticulous ledger of his family. He tracked their births, their minor ailments, their chronic illnesses, and their deaths.
Just tracking them like data points.
The sources describe this ledger as being kept almost exactly like a scientific breeding experiment.
A specimen log of his own offspring. That is chilling. He was documenting the very degeneracy and feebleness he later warned farmers about, but he was watching it unfold in his own children. Let's talk about what was actually in that ledger, because the reality this family faced was heartbreaking.
It was immense suffering. Out of their 10 children, 3 died very young. There was Mary Eleanor, who died at just 2 weeks old. In his diary, Darwin clinically noted her weakness. Then there was Charles Waring, who died at 19 months old.
And the notes on him were pretty specific, right?
Yes, the family records described him as slow and backward, which in today's medical terms strongly suggests severe developmental or genetic issues.
And it wasn't just the early infant losses. Perhaps the most devastating loss for Darwin was his daughter, Anne Elizabeth.
Yes. Anne died at age 10 from tuberculosis. Darwin had meticulously tracked her health leading up to her death, repeatedly describing her as delicate in his notes. He was constantly looking for signs of that hereditary taint his grandfather had written about.
And the children who survived childhood didn't escape these issues either. Several of them suffered terrible chronic health problems. George Howard suffered from severe digestive and neurological issues. Darwin even wrote to a cousin in 1851, explicitly stating, George suffers from hereditary weakness.
And then there was Francis.
Right, another son, Francis, suffered from chronic migraines and possible epilepsy, which, if you remember, is one of the exact symptoms Erasmus Darwin warned about in Zoonomia.
Darwin was trapped. He was tracking all these symptoms, plotting the data points, and observing the exact genetic outcomes he had feared before he ever walked down the aisle.
I can't even imagine the psychological toll that would take on a parent. To not only watch your children suffer, but to have this nagging, scientifically backed voice in your head saying, you knew this might happen.
And Weaver's paper heavily documents Darwin's internal state during this time. Darwin did not observe this suffering with cold detachment. He felt immense, crushing guilt. He wept constantly over his children's beds. He wrote deeply emotional, guilt-ridden letters.
Especially after Anne died.
Right. After his daughter Anne died in 1851, the dam really broke. He wrote a truly devastating letter to his wife, Emma. He said, I sometimes think our children suffer from the closeness of our blood. I wish I had known sooner.
I wish I had known sooner. That line stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
Because we know from that 1838 letter to his sister Caroline that he actually did have an idea sooner. He had the fear. He had read the book. He just chose to push past it.
It is a profound example of cognitive dissonance. He is a man caught completely between his rigorous scientific mind and his deeply human desires, his love for Emma, and his adherence to Victorian family expectations. He could see the biological consequences playing out. He felt the agonizing personal responsibility for it, but he seemingly could not alter his personal behavior.
And that's the part that is really hard to wrap my head around. Because after writing that heartbreaking letter to Emma in 1851, admitting his guilt, explicitly naming the closeness of their blood as the culprit, they didn't stop. They continued to have children. He continued fathering kids until 1858, despite the undeniable evidence right in front of his eyes. I mean, how does a genius justify that to himself?
Well, according to Weaver and Price, the sheer weight of that cognitive dissonance and the profound grief of watching his children suffer forced a massive psychological shift. It fundamentally changed his worldview. You have to remember, Darwin didn't start out as the secular, purely materialist figure we often picture today.
Right, he actually started out studying theology. He was an Anglican. He studied at Cambridge with the intention of becoming a country clergyman.
Yeah.
He believed in a divine creator who designed a perfectly ordered moral world.
Yes, his early worldview was entirely compatible with the divine plan, where suffering had some sort of moral or spiritual framework. But the death of 10-year-old Anne completely shattered that framework. He called her the dearest thing on earth to me. Weaver points out that Darwin's gradual abandonment of Christianity wasn't born out of some malicious anti-religious crusade.
It was just grief.
It was simply because the sheer pain of his reality, the senselessness of his own children suffering from his own choices, made the religious stories stop fitting for him.
He couldn't reconcile a loving, moral God with the torment his children were enduring. So if God isn't in charge, who is? Or what is?
What's fascinating here is Weaver's most profound insight into this psychological shift. Weaver argues that Darwin didn't just deny or ignore his guilt. The human mind can't sustain that level of self-blame. Instead, he redirected it. He completely reframed the very nature of human suffering.
By developing natural selection.
Exactly. By building and committing to his theory of natural selection, Darwin framed all biological life, including humans, as products of random chance, environmental pressure, and blind survival.
Okay, let's pause and really look at that. So by creating a framework where everything is just nature taking its course, where there is no grand moral design, he's essentially removing human moral agency from the equation of life and death.
Precisely. In a psychological sense, Weaver's documentation suggests that natural selection provided a vital coping mechanism. It was a way for Darwin to explain the immense, unbearable personal pain of his family's illnesses without having to bear the crushing weight of personal moral responsibility.
Because it's just biology.
Right. If human suffering, illness, and death are just the cold, mechanical grinding of natural selection, then it wasn't his fault for marrying his cousin. It was just biology running its indifferent course.
Now, he redefined suffering as a natural mechanism rather than a personal failure. That is heavy. It's like the ultimate intellectual defense mechanism. He used his genius to build a shield against his own guilt.
The paper notes that he didn't abandon human dignity. He redefined it out of existence within the context of biological determinism. It was a theory that brilliantly explained animal behavior and the origin of species, but simultaneously acted as a psychological sanctuary for the man who is terrified to apply those rules to his own life choices.
And this explains so much about his behavior afterward. It explains the incredible paradox of his public silence. Because despite all the data he collected in his own home, despite his private admissions of guilt to Emma, Darwin never once publicly linked his tragic personal choices to his grand theory.
Never. There was no public retraction of his marriage, no public apology, no cautionary tale using his own life as the prime example of his agricultural warnings. It remained cold, unfinished data in his personal ledgers.
He kept the public science and the private pain in two completely separate boxes, but those boxes were incredibly fragile.
Which brings us to why he sat on his groundbreaking theory for so long. This fear of a public intersection between his theory of natural selection and human society was crippling for him. Weaver's paper notes that Darwin delayed the publication of On the Origin of Species for 21 years, from 1838, when he first conceived the basic idea, to 1859.
21 years. And it wasn't because he just doubted the science, right? He had the evidence.
He had the evidence. In an 1856 letter to his close colleague Charles Lyell, Darwin explicitly cited his fear of ridicule. He knew that removing a moral creator from human origins would completely upend Victorian society. He only finally published it when another brilliant naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, sent him an essay outlining very similar ideas.
So his hand was basically forced.
Effectively, yes. He had to publish or lose his legacy entirely.
He was absolutely terrified of the backlash. He famously wrote to his close friend, the botanist Joseph Hooker, in 1844, that confessing a human origin without God was, quote, like confessing a murder. Think about that phrasing. Like confessing a murder. He knew exactly how explosive his ideas were and how deeply they challenged the moral framework of his era.
And that societal moral framework was exactly what he was internally wrestling with regarding his own marriage, his own children, and his own perceived culpability.
Now, to fully understand how far Darwin's psychological rationalizations went, Weaver's research takes us into another complicated aspect of the source material, and it revolves around Darwin's private notebooks and later writings.
Yes. Weaver's research doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of Darwin's private notebooks, which unfortunately reflect some severe prejudices of his era. The factual documentation shows that Darwin's personal notebooks contained overt racism. He frequently utilized terms like savages and inferior races.
And it wasn't just casual terminology. The sources note that he actually ranked human populations hierarchically. He placed white Britons at the very top of the evolutionary ladder and ranked other indigenous populations below them, almost like he was classifying insects. It is incredibly jarring to read.
It is. But Weaver's paper does something very interesting here. It links this hierarchical thinking back to Darwin's psychological need to rationalize his family trauma. If we look at his later work, The Descent of Man, which was published in 1871, there's a very specific passage that highlights this. Darwin writes, "The evil effects of close intermarriage are well known, yet in savage tribes it occurs without apparent harm."
Okay, stop right there. Without apparent harm. That is such a specific and frankly convenient caveat to make.
It's a massive loophole. The paper suggests this implies that the harm from interbreeding is somehow contextual, depending on where you sit on his imagined racial hierarchy. It acts as a way to soften the universal reality of what he knew biologically.
So by projecting this idea onto indigenous populations, claiming they can intermarry without consequence, he is creating a tiny bit of theoretical wiggle room for himself.
Precisely. If close intermarriage can occur elsewhere without apparent harm, it allows for the possibility, however faint, that the tragedy in his own home wasn't an absolute, undeniable biological certainty. It provided a psychological rationalization to contextualize and lessen the absolute impact of his own family's choices, even if his private ledgers of his children's illnesses proved otherwise.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive right now? Why spend 20 minutes pulling back the curtain on a 19th century naturalist's family trauma, his secret ledgers, and his private notebooks? I think the big takeaway here is how we view knowledge itself. When you read a textbook or when you learn about a grand foundational theory that shapes the modern world, you have to remember that it doesn't come from Mount Olympus.
It is never handed down in a state of absolute, sterile perfection. Theories are forged by people.
Exactly. It is filtered through living, hurting, deeply contradictory human beings. Darwin wasn't a flawless saint of science, and he wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a brilliant man who was simultaneously tracking his children's fatal illnesses like an experiment, weeping with guilt over his marriage choices, losing his faith in a moral universe, and writing a theory that changed the world while holding prejudiced views to protect his own psyche.
And Weaver's research beautifully highlights the danger of compartmentalization. It shows how ideas, even grand, scientifically sound theories, can act as shields. They can become complex, highly sophisticated ways for even the most brilliant minds to explain away the very things they feel the most responsible for. Darwin built a magnificent structure of biological observation, but the sources argue that the structure also served to protect the architect from his own agonizing reflections.
It's a powerful reminder that science is as much about the human story as it is about the final data point. Research is never just a polite list of facts. It's lived, it's flawed, and it is endlessly messy. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the human realities of scientific history. We hope exploring these profound contradictions gives you a new lens through which to view the theories we all take for granted. Remember, encountering this kind of deep research is never the end of the story. It is just the start of a much larger conversation.
And as we close today's discussion, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If we connect this to the bigger picture, if Charles Darwin's groundbreaking, incredibly objective theory of natural selection was, as Weaver's research suggests, at least partially a psychological survival mechanism to cope with his deeply subjective family tragedy and guilt, how many other foundational scientific theories throughout history were actually born not from a sterile laboratory, but from a genius's desperate need to make sense of their own private pain?
Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep an open mind.